How do two ordinary places, a quiet apartment in New Hampshire and an elevator in a Taipei office tower, become the stage for disappearances that refuse to be explained? Unraveling the Mystery, the Most Disturbing Unsolved Disappearances, is not a hunt for spectacle. It's an attempt to hold the fragile facts we have up to the light, to follow the small, stubborn threads left behind, and to listen to the people who have been living without answers for decades. The first story begins on a simple evening in April 1980 in an apartment building in Manchester, New Hampshire. 13-year-old Laureen Ann Rahn was home alone, while her mother, Judith, was out of town. Friends were there that night, at least one stayed over, and a male acquaintance was reportedly present earlier in the evening. What followed was a narrowing window of time, a handful of odd details, and then a silence that widened into years. Laureen's age is worth pausing on. 13 is not an age of assumed independence. It is an age of small rebellions and risky experiments, yes, but also of vulnerability. Her family situation, a mother who traveled occasionally for work, a neighborhood where neighbors knew one another by sight, framed what should have been an ordinary night. Instead, it became a riddle. The timeline, as pieced together from police reports, contemporaneous news coverage, and interviews with family members, is tight but jagged in places where memory and record don't quite fit. Around midnight, voices were heard in the hallway. Neighbors later reported people coming and going, doors opening and closing. At about 12:30 a.m., some of those voices receded. A male friend reportedly left the apartment sometime before Judith returned. Judith came back between roughly 1:15 and 2 a.m., accounts vary within that range, and found the building's hallways dimmer than she expected. Light bulbs in the corridor fixtures were unscrewed, she later told investigators. The front door to the apartment was unlocked. A female friend who had spent the night was asleep on a couch. Her statement that she believed Laureen had slept there as well conflicted with the fact that Laureen was not present. The scene that greeted Judith is one of those images that lingers precisely because it makes little sense. There were no obvious signs of struggle. Routine household items were in odd places or missing entirely. Clothes were reportedly absent from Laureen's room, while later the girl's purse and shoes were found near the living room couch. Investigators recorded those details. Neighbors' recollections have been consistent enough to form the spine of the original missing person report. What do unscrewed light bulbs mean? How do you explain a front door unlocked, yet no sign that someone left in a hurry? In a moment, those small domestic irregularities, the mismatched placement of a shoe, the loosened bulb, became the central clues the police had to work with, and also the things that made the case so unnerving. It was not a violent scene. It was not a neat exit either. These are the kinds of cases that create more questions than answers, because whichever way you turn them, something important refuses to add up. Law enforcement treated Laureen's disappearance as a missing person case. They interviewed friends, neighbors, and the young woman who claimed to have slept there. They canvassed nearby bus stations and alerted transit authorities. One possible sighting surfaced months later. A bus driver in Boston allegedly recalled a girl matching Laureen's description boarding a bus. That lead has been described as tentative and is officially unverified. Memory, especially months after the fact, is notoriously fragile. Some witnesses later could not confidently identify Laureen in a lineup or in photographs. When a sighting is separated from immediate corroboration, it has a tenuous life. It gives hope, and it complicates closure. Then, there were odd entries on a phone bill months after Laureen vanished. Judith reportedly noticed charges from out-of-state motels, locations in California, and, in one instance, an item listed as contact with a hotline associated with sexual exploitation. Those entries, as presented in public accounts and family statements, are unverified in the sense that paperwork linking a specific person at those numbers to Laureen was never made public, and investigators have not confirmed a direct transaction. They stand in the record as anomalies, part of the paper trail that raises possibilities without resolving them. Another recurring element in the family story, a small, quiet terror that crept into routine, was the repeated late-night calls Judith began to receive after Laureen vanished. For years, she reported, the telephone would ring at exactly 3:45 a.m., and on other nights she would pick up to find silence at the other end. Those are the kinds of details that resist easy explanation, a pattern that suggests someone was dialing deliberately, and yet no voice, no message, no claim. The calls were a punctuation mark in a sentence that had no subject. Over time, rumors seeped into the wider narrative. One name that surfaced in some accounts, referred to by locals and in certain secondary sources as Dr. Z, was described as an alleged videographer linked to motel activity in which underage girls were allegedly exploited. It is critical, as investigators and journalists have consistently warned, to treat such allegations with caution. The association of a name with a rumor does not equate to verified responsibility. In Laureen's case, any alleged link to Dr. Z or to an exploitative network remains unconfirmed and should be understood as unverified allegation, not prosecution or proof. What can be responsibly said is that the early investigative trail in 1980 faced both the limitations of the era and the complexity of human testimony. Paper records could be cross-checked only so far. Witness memories clouded over months. If someone boarded a bus and left town, the chain of custody of that sighting depended on the good memory of a busy driver and the discretion of transit staff who may not have kept detailed passenger logs. If calls appeared on a family phone bill, tracing the caller's identity required cooperation across state lines and the willingness of phone companies to release records, efforts that were administratively heavier then than they often are now. Investigators explored multiple theories. One was runaway, that a troubled teenager, perhaps responding to pressure at home or at school, had chosen to leave and had planned it in such a way that tracking her would be difficult. This theory addressed why certain personal items might be missing, and why there were possible out-of-state traces. Family members and friends, however, pushed back hard on that possibility. They described Laureen as not having the temperament of someone about to take off alone for an extended time, and pointed to a number of small but telling details: the absence of a planned note, the neatness of her room earlier that evening, that seemed inconsistent with a deliberate disappearance. Another theory was abduction, perhaps opportunistic. The unlocked door, the unscrewed bulbs, the incomplete assemblage of personal effects left in the apartment provided fertile ground for speculation about someone entering and taking Laureen. Yet the lack of forced entry and the absence of clear physical struggle complicated this explanation. That contradiction, signs that could support either voluntary exit or involuntary removal, is what has haunted the case for decades. A third avenue of investigation, raised publicly and privately, concerned possible exploitation networks. In the ensuing years, stories emerged nationally about predatory groups operating transregionally, arranging travel and accommodations for underage victims. The phone bill entries and alleged connections to motels in other states fed this theory in the public imagination. Again, the available documentation does not allow us to conclude that Laureen was connected to any such network. Investigators labeled such links speculative without corroborative evidence. But for Judith and for anyone who watched the case unfold, the mere possibility of her child being trafficked beyond their ability to track was an additional source of anguish. It's important to step back and note how these theories function in a case like Laureen's. They are not a ladder that leads upward toward a single definitive truth. They are instead a ring of possible explanations that can all be partially consistent with the fragmentary evidence. Each theory illuminates aspects of the situation, motive, opportunity, method, but none on its own closes the circle. The human consequence of that open circle is devastatingly concrete. In interviews years after the disappearance, Judith described living in suspended time, sleep fractured by phone rings at odd hours, ordinary routines forever shadowed by the question of where her daughter had gone. Friends and neighbors spoke of a woman who could not let the case go, who responded to every rumor and tip with fierce hope and, equally often, renewed disappointment. The daily life of a disappearance ripples beyond the missing person. It reshapes community, fractures family narratives, and forces those left behind into a loop of waiting. For the investigators, the case became one of those cold files that hover at the edge of attention, open, active in a sparse way, but without the fresh leads that would propel a focused operation. Over the years, appeals were made, posters distributed, rewards offered. Wings for Children, a local nonprofit involved in missing child advocacy that is mentioned in some public records, assisted at points by providing outreach and support to the family. Their role, like that of many advocacy groups, was to maintain public interest and to keep channels open for potential tips. None of these efforts yielded the breakthrough the family sought. One methodological detail that has been overlooked in some retellings is the difference between an absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Police often had to be clear. An item being missing does not prove it was taken. A phone charge does not prove a person was physically present where the charge originated. A bus sighting does not prove the identity of the passenger. Those distinctions are critical to avoid conflating plausible stories with proven facts. And yet, for the people living the life after a disappearance, those distinctions sometimes feel unsatisfying. The lack of certainty is itself an injury. And still, a pattern emerges when we look at the majority of the verifiable facts. A short window of time on a single night, a domestic space made strange by small alterations, some items missing and some items left behind, limited witnesses whose memories diverge on crucial points. Add to that the occasional out-of-state hint and the long, peculiar pattern of silent calls, and you have a case that sits uneasily between human error, adolescent turmoil, and a possible darker external force. That uneasy position is what keeps this story alive in the public imagination, and what keeps investigators, family members, and advocates returning to it. It is tempting in moments like this to reach for certainty, but the responsible path is restraint. For every rumor that has circulated in weekend newspaper columns or in the whisper lines at memorial vigils, the public record requires a label, unverified.
For every witness who later says, "I thought I saw her," we must say the same, tentative. The case's cold status is not a moral failing by investigators. It is a function of missing data and the human limits of recollection. The social context of 1980 also matters. Law enforcement resources were different then. Databases were not interconnected the way they are now. The concept of digital traces, metadata, surveillance networks, and cross-border communication logs did not exist in practical terms for most missing person investigations. A sighting on a bus depended on someone who would remember, on a clerk who might log an odd occurrence, or on an operator who might check a list months later. Today, by contrast, CCTV networks and digital ticketing can, in some cases, produce a clear chain of movement. The past did not always afford that luxury. Still, even modern technology is not omnipotent. Documentary evidence can be incomplete. People move when coaxed or when frightened, and their traces can disappear in minutes. That observation will become important as we shift from Laureen's domestic mystery to a case whose central bafflement involves cameras that did record and yet stopped short of capturing the answer. Before we leave Laureen's story, there are a few more elements to settle, precisely because detail matters in a case defined by them. The purse and shoes reportedly found near the couch later the same night. These were described in initial police statements and family recollection as evidence that complicated the scene. If Laureen had left willingly, why were some personal items left behind? If she had been taken, why were other items scattered rather than removed? The unscrewed light bulbs remain an especially eerie detail. They are small acts, almost mischievous in their domestic quality, and yet in context they feel like arranged markers pointing towards something hidden. When public conversations turn to possible exploitation networks, the most sensational claims often attach themselves to the vaguest links. That tends to happen whenever a case touches on the broader anxieties of a community. But caution is necessary. The allegation tied to Dr. Z and to motel activity is part of that pattern, a rumor anchored to an unverified name. Responsible retelling keeps that label intact. Investigators did, by some accounts, probe motel records and followed leads wherever paperwork allowed. The public record does not conclusively disclose that any motel-based lead produced a confirmed connection to Laureen. Beyond the arc of the initial investigation, the family lived with the follow-through, periodic appeals on television and in newspapers, occasional tip lines that produced nothing solid, and the emotional labor of continuing to believe that somewhere, someone knew something that could change everything.
The psychic weight of that uncertainty is a form of slow violence. It is exhaustion worn like a second skin, a reheated hope after every ambiguous lead, a ritual of checking doors and making lists and replaying the last night in a mind that refuses to move on. How do we hold that anguish while also doing the hard work of inquiry? We hold it by naming the limits of what we know and by refusing to convert rumor into indictment. That is a discipline that honors both the victims and the integrity of the investigation. The story of Laureen Rahn is one of small details and big absences. Unscrewed bulbs, an unlocked door, a missing teenage girl, years of unanswered questions. But it is not the only story of its kind, not by a long stretch. In a different part of the world, 28 years later, another ordinary place, this time a finance building in Taipei, would yield an image on camera that looks deceptively conclusive until you examine what happens next. Pause for a moment and imagine footage from a security camera, grainy, time-stamped, an elevator door whispering open, a woman entering carrying a child. Cameras often become proof when words aren't enough, but they also can be the most confounding form of evidence. They show movement, presence, a sequence, and yet a sequence can end in a way that the human mind refuses to accept, not with violence, but with absence. That will be the center of our second case. Before we get there, one last note about procedure and the public. If you have credible information about either of the cases we are discussing, something verifiable, something that can be corroborated with records, or that you can attest to under oath, please submit it through the story suggestion form linked below. Tips that are vague or uncorroborated can create more confusion than clarity. What investigators and families need are specific leads: names, dates, receipts, ticket stubs, contemporaneous notes, anything that can be checked against an official record. It is a short appeal, and it is the only one I will make here. These cases are not fodder for standing room speculation. They are open questions with very real human stakes. With that in mind, let's move from a dim hallway in Manchester to the antiseptic corridors of a finance building in Taipei. The contrast is stark. One disappearance happened in an era of limited records and analog phone lines. The other unfolded in a space surveilled by a battery of cameras, where the last clear images of a mother and her child are preserved on tape. It would be tempting to think that cameras guarantee answers. They do not. Sometimes they only sharpen the shape of a question.
If the first case taught us to be suspicious of ordinary domestic clues, the way a small act like unscrewing a bulb can become freighted with meaning, the second case will force us to confront the baffling reality that even recorded sequences, when they abruptly end, can be as impenetrable as the darkest night. In Taipei, the elevator footage gives us frames to study: a woman removing coats, shoes left on the floor, a mother studying a child, and then a decision point. The elevator stops, they exit to the 11th floor, they turn left into a hallway, and they step into a stairwell. That is where the visible story concludes. From there, the narrative becomes a meticulous search, a catalog of empty places, stairwells that show no sign, rooftops that disclose nothing, vents and passages checked and checked again. Every camera angle becomes a question mark. The second case is not a mirror of the first. It is a different shade of the same human horror. Being present and then not being present, having a trail that narrows to nothing. As we prepare to examine that footage frame by frame, to listen to what security logs and building residents recall, and to weigh the theories that surfaced in Taipei in the days and years after, remember the standard we set in Manchester. Label rumor as unverified, separate witness recollection from documentary confirmation, and treat every hypothesis as provisional. Because until we can point to a single verifiable chain of events in either story, the central question remains: how do people disappear from places designed to keep them safe? The elevator footage is the kind of thing that lodges in your mind and won't let go. The frame is grainy, the timestamp faint but legible, just before 9 p.m. A fluorescent panel throws a thin wash of light across stainless steel walls. The camera angle is high, slightly to one side, the kind of shot meant to record shapes and movement, not intimacy. In the first visible frame, a woman steps onto the elevator carrying a small child pressed to her chest. The child's head turns once toward the camera, a brief, baffled glance. The woman wears a dark coat. A second coat is slung over her arm. Their shoes catch on the cheap tile as they shift weight. The elevator hums and the doors whisper closed. What follows is a sequence that reads like an ordinary, exhausted commute home. The woman takes the coats off. She sets one on the elevator seat, and then, in a detail that would later become central to every retelling, she and the child remove their shoes. The shoes are arranged near the elevator wall, one pair slightly askew as if hastily abandoned. For a moment the scene is domestic, a mother adjusting a child's sweater, a tired exchange of small words. The elevator climbs. At the 11th floor ding, the doors reopen.
The timestamp shows the moment clearly enough to anchor the narrative. The frame captures them stepping out, a corridor stretching ahead, fluorescent lights down its length. They turn left. A hallway camera at a shallow angle catches their backs as they move toward a stairwell entrance. They pass a security door and move toward the stairwell door, which, by all recorded measures, is visible to cameras that cover floor access. The woman steps in with the child. The camera follows them for a fraction of a second as they disappear into the stairwell mouth. Then the footage ends. No return, no second figure in the frame, no passing shadow that explains their absence. That is the image: a woman, a child, a stairwell door, and then nothing. The seemingly conclusive footage gives the illusion of resolution because it presents a path, elevator, corridor, stairwell, but it provides no exit point where the path should conclude. The stairwell, every stair, every landing, every rooftop was checked. Maintenance crews, police, neighbors, and family members crawled through ducts, peered into service shafts, opened ceiling tiles, and pried loose panels. They inspected rooftop access, utility rooms, and the area directly outside the stairwell. They checked the underside of stair treads, the ledges, the oil-stained crawl spaces no one wants to know about. They found nothing that would explain a person simply vanishing. Security systems in the building were, by the accounts in local reports, robust enough to make the absence of follow-up footage uncanny. Entry to certain floors required keycards, and cameras monitored main egress points and fire exits. Building logs were consulted. Elevator maintenance records were reviewed. The possibility that the footage had been tampered with was floated in public speculation, but investigators quickly noted that there was no obvious evidence of editing in the available copies. Moreover, the original tapes were preserved, were authenticated by technicians in the early stages of the inquiry. That technical verification, however, only deepened the mystery. The tapes were real, the sequence unbroken up until the stairwell entrance, and yet the physical search produced emptiness. Neighbors and building staff were interviewed. A security guard who later spoke with reporters described the woman as appearing agitated in the days before the disappearance, an impression that family members corroborated in the sense of noting increased stress in her behavior. Those reports were part of a broader portrait offered by relatives: domestic strain, arguments at home, a sense of growing instability. Friends said she had been under pressure. One family member told local press that she had been not herself in the weeks leading up to the night in question. Those are the kinds of observations that humanize a case, but they are also by nature subjective. They establish context without delivering proof.
Investigators considered a range of explanations, and they labeled them plainly in official files: official theory, investigator hypothesis, popular theory. The official statement in the immediate aftermath tended toward the practical. The woman and child exited the elevator, entered the stairwell, and were unaccounted for after that point. Follow-up searches and witness canvasses produced no verified sightings beyond the tape. An investigator hypothesis entertained the possibility of voluntary exit from the building via a route not monitored by cameras, an obscure service corridor or a maintenance shaft that could be accessed by someone who knew the building's layout intimately. That line of inquiry required proving access. It yielded no confirmed route. Other theories were more painful to contemplate. Suicide was considered and then deprioritized when searchers found no evidence on rooftops or other typical sites. The secret lover hypothesis, that the woman might have arranged a clandestine meeting with someone she trusted who then spirited her away, was treated as possible but unprovable. Investigators sought to identify anyone who might have had an opportunity for quick departure, but found no corroborating phone records or transactional evidence. Abduction remained a persistent, if deeply troubling, possibility. The speed and efficiency with which a perpetrator could move in a secured building, bypass cameras, and transport two people out of the premises would require planning and boldness. Yet the building was not wholly insecure. Egress points were observed by residents and staff. For every abduction scenario proposed, there were logistical obstacles that made it less straightforward. The stairwell itself became the locus of obsession. Stairwells look like transition spaces, a practical place between floors, yet they are often blind spots in surveillance. Cameras that monitor corridors sometimes do not record inside stairwells, and physical access to maintenance chutes or adjacent rooms can offer fleeting routes that evade straightforward detection. Investigators meticulously documented the stairwell's architecture. They measured distances to the nearest exterior window, checked the security of stairwell doors, and compared floor plans with the tape to determine any discrepancy between the visible route and the recorded building schematics. Nothing suggested a structural flaw that would allow for a clean disappearance without leaving physical traces. It is worth pausing on the footage again because the small things have weight in cases like this. The woman removes coats and shoes in the elevator. Why? Did she feel suddenly exposed to cold? Was she attempting to travel lighter? Did she think shoes would be uncomfortable on a long walk? Or were these ordinary actions that later telescoped into significance because of the subsequent absence?
Those details are easily fetishized by speculation, but they are also precisely the kinds of human gestures that investigators catalog. Behavior is data when it's the only data you have left. Press coverage in Taipei and in international outlets followed the case closely, in part because the footage fed a narrative hunger for the uncanny, surveillance that shows movement and yet ends in a void. Local authorities faced criticism and support in quick succession.
Some residents insisted the building was safe, that cameras and key card protocols made nefarious exits difficult. Others pointed to maintenance staff who had keys and to contractors who moved through service passages with impunity. The tension between formal security measures and the informal rhythms of building life, contractors, cleaning staff, maintenance crews, deliveries, became a theme in the investigation. Access is only as secure as the people who guard it, and people make mistakes or act negligently. The family of the woman and child cooperated with investigators, providing background and accounts of the mother's state of mind. They described in aggregated statements a household under strain, arguments, financial pressure, and episodes of emotional volatility. Those recollections do not prove a motive, nor do they explain the mechanical question of how two people seemingly disappeared into a stairwell and were never found. What they do provide is context, a human story behind the frames on a monitor. That context is important because it resists the flattening impulse of footage alone. Images can be shocking, but they do not convey the texture of someone's life. In 2013, years after the original inquiry, authorities reopened aspects of the case for a methodical reinvestigation. The review revisited tapes, re-interviewed witnesses, rechecked maintenance logs, and reassessed the building's security footprint. Technicians scanned earlier recordings with improved forensic tools, looking for anomalies that had been imperceptible in older copies. No new lead emerged. The reinvestigation, which had raised hope among family and community members, closed without producing verifiable evidence that could solve the riddle. That procedural revisitation is typical in stubborn disappearances. Circumstances change, technology improves, and investigators hope that patience will yield a clue missed the first time. In this case, patience yielded another quiet, no fresh path forward. Two images from the Taipei building stuck in public memory. One is the jackets and shoes left in the elevator, domestic detritus that suddenly appears charged with meaning. The other is the stairwell frame, a dark mouth that swallows two figures and returns only silence. Both images expose the gap between what cameras record and what cameras cannot account for. Surveillance is a net. Sometimes the net shows you the fish. Sometimes it only shows the water where the fish used to be.
Across both cases, Manchester and Taipei, similar themes recur. Ordinary spaces, designed for routine and safety, become instruments of mystery. A hallway, a living room, an elevator, places where people expect to be seen and to return. The discrepancy between recorded evidence and lived testimony is also striking. In Laureen's case, the physical scene is ambiguous. In Lou's case, the recorded sequence is clear but ends without resolution. In both, families live with uncertainty that erodes ordinary time. That parallel is not coincidence. It reveals a deeper fact about disappearances in the modern era. They exploit the seams between what is observed and what is not. What do modern disappearances expose about our systems? First, that surveillance technologies, cameras, logs, electronic records, are powerful, but they are not infallible. Cameras provide fragments, not narratives. They capture motion and leave motive unrecorded. They can be circumvented, misinterpreted, or simply incomplete. Second, the quality of witness memory is variable. People who think they saw something may be mistaken in small but crucial ways. Time dilutes clarity. And third, institutional limits matter. Investigators can only follow what exists on paper, on tape, or in a statement. Where records are absent or interactions informal, the trail grows cold quickly. There is also a social dimension that ties both stories together. Families endure a double suffering in these cases, the initial fear and the ongoing limbo. A disappearance does not end when a search does. It persists as an absence that reshapes relationships and daily habits. Mothers stop sleeping through the night. Children who grow up without answers learn to live with hypothetical narratives that never become fact. Community compassion can be sustaining, but public attention fades. The task of advocacy groups and of prosecutors is partly to keep those stories visible long enough for new information to surface. That is why periodic reinvestigations and appeals remain crucial. Breakthroughs often come from the smallest overlooked detail: a receipt found in an attic, a taxi driver remembering a backseat conversation, an old motel ledger newly digitized. In both cases, rumors and speculative narratives assaulted the factual record. The name Dr. Z in Manchester and whispered suggestions about secret routes in Taipei circulated in coffee shops and online comment threads. It is a human impulse to fill silence with story, but the cost of that impulse can be real. False leads waste precious resources and impose additional trauma on families. Part of responsible investigation is resisting the seduction of tidy explanations in favor of patient corroborated inquiry.
What can viewers learn from these two disappearances? First, treat evidence with care. A camera does not tell the whole story, and absence of visible motion beyond a point does not necessarily mean there was a conspiracy.
Second, if you have information, make it specific and verifiable. Provide names, dates, receipts, or records that investigators can check. Third, understand that the human need for closure should not overwhelm the need for accuracy. Sympathy is vital. Rumor is not. The most unnerving question these cases force us to hold is simple and terrible. How do people vanish from places designed to keep them safe? There is no single answer. Sometimes it's a confluence of small decisions, hidden routes, and forensic limitations. Sometimes it's an orchestrated act that leaves little trace. Often it's a tangle of both. What is certain is that each disappearance leaves an aftermath that reorganizes lives. As we close this investigation into two of the most disturbing unsolved disappearances, it is worth returning to the human stake. These are not abstract puzzles. They are mothers and daughters, friends and neighbors, whose absence has left holes no investigation can neatly patch. For families, the work of living with not knowing is ongoing. For communities, the obligation is to remember, to keep channels open, and to support thorough, evidence-based inquiry. If you watched the footage, read the records, or lived near these events, and you recognize a face, a voice, a route, or a transaction that could change the course of one of these cases, please use the official channels. For sources, documents, and to submit tips that investigators can verify, see the description below where we've linked police reports, archived news articles, and the official tip form. Respectful, specific, corroborated information is what moves a cold case toward warmth. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe and check the description for those links. Above all, hold the victims in your thought as people, not as mysteries, and hold the families in your patience as they wait for answers that, for now, remain painfully out of reach.